The sheriff was screaming into her radio, her face twisted with rage as she stared at the trench I had just dug across my own property. Water was gushing everywhere, and her illegal water line lay exposed in the mud like a guilty secret finally brought to light. "I need backup now. He is destroying public property," she shrieked, even though we both knew the truth. That is when I realized Sheriff Karen President had been stealing my water for 3 years, and she would do anything to cover it up. I never imagined that inheriting my grandfather's old farmhouse would lead me into a war with the local sheriff. After 20 years of city living, I was ready for the peace and quiet of rural life. The property sat on 12 acres of rolling hills, with an old barn and a house that needed work but had good bones. My grandfather had passed away 6 months earlier, and it took that long to settle the estate. When I finally got the keys, I felt like I was starting a new chapter. No more traffic, no more noisy neighbors, just the sound of wind through the trees and the freedom to do what I wanted on my own land. The first month was pure bliss. I spent my days clearing brush, fixing the front porch, and planning where I would put a workshop. The neighbors were friendly enough, mostly keeping to themselves like good country folk do. Everything seemed perfect until the first water bill arrived. $850 for 1 month. I called the water company 3 times, certain there had been a mistake. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. The meter reading was accurate, she said. Perhaps there was a leak somewhere on the property. I spent that weekend crawling around the house, checking every pipe and faucet I could find. Nothing. No leaks, no running water, no explanation for why my bill was triple what it should have been. That was when I started paying attention to the water meter itself. The numbers kept climbing even when I was not using any water at all. I turned off the main valve to the house and watched the meter for an hour. It never stopped spinning. Someone else was using water that was running through my meter. That was the day I first met Sheriff Karen President. I was standing by the water meter, notebook in hand, trying to figure out where the extra water was going when her patrol car pulled into my driveway. She was a large woman with short gray hair and the kind of permanent scowl that suggested she had been having a bad day for about 10 years. "You having some kind of problem out here?" she asked, stepping out of her car with the slow, deliberate movements of someone used to intimidating people just by showing up. "Just trying to figure out why my water bill is so expensive," I said, keeping my tone friendly. "Seems like someone might be using water that is running through my meter." Her expression shifted slightly, and I caught something in her eyes that I could not quite place. Not concern exactly, more like awareness. "Well, you be careful poking around utilities," she said, her voice carrying a warning that seemed heavier than the situation called for. "Sometimes people think they know what they are doing and end up causing real problems." She looked at the meter, then at me, then back at the meter. "You just moved in, right? Sometimes it takes a while to understand how things work around here." There was something in her tone that made my skin crawl. It was not helpful advice from a concerned neighbor. It was a threat wrapped in small-town politeness. I watched her drive away, and for the first time since inheriting the property, I felt like I was not welcome. The next month, my water bill was even higher, $912. I called the water company again, and this time I demanded someone come out to check the meter. They sent a technician who confirmed what I already knew. The meter was working perfectly. Someone was definitely using water that was being charged to my account. I started keeping a log. Every morning and every evening I wrote down the meter reading. I documented every gallon of water I used. The math was undeniable. Someone was using almost 3 times as much water as I was, and I was paying for all of it. I hired Jake Morrison, a local contractor who had helped my grandfather with plumbing issues over the years. Jake was a quiet man in his 50s who knew every pipe and utility line in the county. When I explained the situation, he nodded like he had seen this problem before. "We need to trace where that water line goes," he said. "Sometimes the old connections get mixed up, especially in properties that have been around as long as yours." We started by mapping out the visible water lines around my house. Jake brought his metal detector and started following the main line as it left the meter. What we found made my blood boil. The water line split about 50 feet from the meter. One branch went to my house, just like it should have. But the other branch turned north, crossed my property line, and disappeared under the fence into the yard next door. "That is not supposed to be there," Jake said, shaking his head. "Someone put in an unauthorized connection. This is completely illegal." The house next door was a nice 2-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn and a swimming pool. I had never met the owners, but I had seen the woman who lived there coming and going in a patrol car. My stomach dropped as I realized who my water-stealing neighbor was. Sheriff Corinne President lived next door, and she had been using my water to fill her pool, water her lawn, and run her household for who knows how long. The math suddenly made sense. A house with a pool and a large yard would use exactly the amount of extra water that was showing up on my bills. Before I could decide what to do with this information, I heard a car door slam. Sheriff President was walking across my yard toward us, her face already red with anger. "What the hell do you think you are doing on my property line?" she demanded, her hand resting on her service weapon. "We are on my property," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And we just found your water line running through my yard without permission." "That is a lie," she snapped. "That line has been there for decades. You do not know what you are talking about." Jake stepped forward, holding his metal detector. "Ma'am, I can show you exactly where the unauthorized connection was made. This is a clear violation of—" "You need to get off this property right now," she interrupted, pointing at Jake. "Both of you, before I arrest you for trespassing." "We are on my property," I repeated, but my voice was shaking now. The way she was looking at me, the way her hand kept moving toward her gun, made it clear that facts and property lines did not matter to her. What mattered was power, and she had it. "I am going to give you one warning," she said, stepping closer. "Stop digging around where you do not belong. Some things are better left alone." She turned and walked away, but not before looking back at us with an expression that promised serious consequences if we did not drop this immediately. Jake was packing up his equipment, his hands moving faster than they had been a few minutes earlier. "We found what we needed to find," he said quietly. "But you need to be careful how you handle this. That woman has a lot of power in this town." I spent 3 days researching water theft laws and property rights before I worked up the courage to confront Sheriff President directly. The evidence was clear. She had illegally connected to my water line and had been stealing hundreds of dollars worth of water every month. This was not a misunderstanding or an old connection that had been forgotten. This was deliberate theft. I walked over to her house on a Saturday morning, planning to be reasonable and give her a chance to make this right. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement to split the water bill or have her pay me back for what she had stolen. I wanted to believe that a law enforcement officer would do the right thing when confronted with clear evidence of wrongdoing. I was wrong. She answered the door in her uniform, even though it was her day off. The message was clear. She was not going to talk to me as a neighbor. She was going to talk to me as a sheriff talking to a potential criminal. "I know about the water line," I said before she could speak. "I know you have been using my water for years. I have documentation and proof." Her face went from annoyed to furious in less than a second. "You do not know what you are talking about," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "And I am getting tired of your harassment." Harassment? I could not believe what I was hearing. "You have been stealing my water and I am the one harassing you." "That water line has been there since before you were born," she said, stepping out onto her porch. "Just because you inherited some property does not mean you get to come in here and start making accusations." "I have proof," I said, pulling out the photos Jake had taken of the illegal connection. "You can see right here where the line was tapped into." She slapped the photos out of my hand. "I do not care about your fake evidence. You are harassing a law enforcement officer, and that is a crime." The way she said it made my blood run cold. This was not a threat. This was a promise. She was telling me exactly what would happen if I continued to push this issue. "I am going to file a complaint with the water company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I am going to file a police report for theft of services." She laughed, and it was the most chilling sound I had ever heard. "File whatever you want. Let me know how that works out for you." "You cannot just steal from people because you have a badge," I said, my anger finally overriding my fear. "Watch me," she said, and went back inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood there for a moment, shaking with rage and fear. This was not how things were supposed to work. Police officers were supposed to uphold the law, not break it. But I was beginning to understand that Sheriff Corinne President saw her badge as a license to do whatever she wanted. I walked home and immediately called the water company to file a complaint. The customer service representative was polite but not particularly helpful. They would send someone out to investigate, she said, but it might take several weeks. In the meantime, I would be responsible for paying my bills. Then I called the state police to file a complaint about the theft. The officer who took my call listened patiently to my story, then asked me a question that made my stomach drop. "Have you tried talking to your local sheriff about this?" When I explained that the local sheriff was the person stealing from me, there was a long pause. "We will look into it," he said finally, but I could hear in his voice that he had already decided this was not worth his time. The next 2 weeks were the most frustrating of my life. Every phone call I made, every office I visited, every complaint I filed led to the same result. Nothing. The system that was supposed to protect me from exactly this kind of corruption was completely useless. The water company investigation consisted of one technician coming out to look at my meter. He confirmed that there was an unauthorized connection, but when I asked what they were going to do about it, he just shrugged. "We report our findings to the county," he said. "After that, it is out of our hands." The county office was even worse. The clerk who handled my complaint was a nervous woman in her 20s who kept looking over her shoulder while we talked. When I mentioned Sheriff President's name, she actually flinched. "I will make sure this gets to the right people," she said, but she would not look me in the eye. "You should expect a response within 30 days. 30 days turned into 45, then 60. Every time I called, I got a different excuse. The inspector was busy. The paperwork had been mislaid. They were waiting for additional documentation. It became clear that my complaint was going to disappear into a bureaucratic black hole. Meanwhile, Sheriff President's harassment campaign was escalating. She started driving by my house multiple times a day, slowing down to stare at me if I was outside. She pulled me over twice for supposed traffic violations that resulted in warnings but no tickets. Both times, She made it clear that she could make my life very difficult if I continued to cause problems. The worst incident happened on a Thursday evening. I was getting out of my truck when she pulled into my driveway behind me, blocking me in. She got out of her patrol car and walked toward me with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator. "I heard you have been calling around town, making accusations," she said, her hand resting on her service weapon. "That is not a smart thing to do." "I am just trying to resolve this water issue," I said, my heart pounding. "All you have to do is pay for what you used." "I have not used anything," she said, "and I am getting tired of your harassment. Next time you call someone about me, I am going to have to take official action." "What kind of official action?" She smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen. "The kind that involves handcuffs and a jail cell. See, the thing about being sheriff is that people tend to believe what I tell them. And what I am going to tell them is that you have been threatening a police officer." "I have never threatened you." "That is not what my report is going to say," she said, leaning closer. "Your word against mine. Who do you think they are going to believe?" She got back in her car and left, but her message was clear. If I continued to fight this, she would destroy me. She had the power to arrest me on false charges, and there was nothing I could do to stop her. That night, I sat in my kitchen and tried to figure out what to do. I could give up and accept that I was going to pay for her water for as long as I lived here. Or I could keep fighting and risk ending up in jail on trumped-up charges. I thought about my grandfather who had worked this land for 40 years. He had taught me that sometimes you have to stand up for what is right, even when it is hard, even when it is dangerous. I called Jake Morrison the next morning. "I need you to help me trace that water line," I said, "all the way to her house, and I need you to document everything." "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "She is not going to like it." "I am sure," I said. "If the system will not help me, I am going to help myself." "What are you planning to do?" I stared out my window at the perfect lawn next door, the lawn that was being watered with my stolen water. "I am going to dig up that line and cut it off." "That is going to cause a war," Jake warned. "The war already started," I said. "She just did not expect me to fight back." The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I found Sheriff President standing in my backyard, holding a clipboard and wearing a smug expression that made my blood boil. "I am conducting an inspection of your property for code violations," she announced, not bothering to explain why she thought she had the authority to do that. "I have received several complaints about illegal modifications to utility lines." The irony was staggering. She was accusing me of illegal modifications to utility lines while her own illegal water connection was running right under our feet. But I could see what she was doing. She was building a case against me, creating a paper trail that would justify whatever action she planned to take. "You need a warrant to be on my property," I said, pulling out my phone to record the conversation. "I do not need a warrant for a utility inspection," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "And I am going to need you to stop recording me. That is interfering with a police investigation. This is my property, and I have every right to record what happens here." She looked up from her clipboard with those cold, calculating eyes. "Put the phone away, or I will arrest you for obstruction." I put the phone away, but I kept it running in my pocket. If she was going to make false accusations, I wanted evidence of her actual behavior. She spent 20 minutes wandering around my property, taking photos and making notes. When she finished, she handed me a citation for unauthorized utility modifications and told me I had 30 days to correct the violations or face criminal charges. That was when I realized she was never going to stop. She was going to keep escalating until she destroyed me completely. The system was not going to help me. No one was going to stand up to her. If I wanted this to end, I was going to have to end it myself. I called Jake that afternoon and told him to bring his excavator. "I want you to dig a trench across my property line," I said, "right where that water line runs." "That is going to cut off her water supply," he said. "That is the point. It is my water line. I can do whatever I want with it." "She is going to lose her mind." "Good. Maybe when she loses her mind, people will finally see what she really is." Jake arrived early the next morning with his excavator. I had spent the night documenting everything, taking photos of the illegal connection, recording video of the water meter running even when I was not using any water, and writing down every detail of Sheriff President's harassment campaign. We started digging at sunrise. The excavator made quick work of the hard-packed dirt, and within an hour we had exposed the entire illegal water line. It was even more extensive than I had realized. She had not just tapped into my line for basic water service. She had installed a separate line to fill her swimming pool and another one to run her sprinkler system. For 3 years, she had been using my water to maintain her perfect suburban lifestyle while threatening me for asking questions about my own water bill. The evidence was undeniable. No one could look at this setup and claim it was an innocent mistake. That was when I heard the screaming. Sheriff President had come outside to check why her water had suddenly stopped working, and she could see the excavator in my yard. She came running across the property line, her face purple with rage, screaming threats and obscenities that would have gotten anyone else arrested for disturbing the peace. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she shrieked, grabbing my arm hard enough to leave bruises. "I am fixing my water line," I said, pulling free from her grip. "This is my property and my water line." "You are destroying public property. This is criminal damage." "It is not public property. It is my property, and you have been stealing from me for years." She pulled out her radio and started screaming into it, demanding backup, demanding that I be arrested, demanding that someone stop me from exposing her crimes. But there was no going back now. The truth was literally uncovered, lying in the mud for everyone to see. Sheriff President's 911 call was a masterpiece of hysteria and lies. She claimed I was destroying public utilities, threatening her with violence, and damaging county infrastructure. Her voice was so high and frantic that the dispatcher had to ask her to repeat herself multiple times. "I need every available unit at 47 Maple Ridge Road immediately," she screamed into her radio. "We have a subject destroying public property and threatening a police officer." Within minutes, I could hear sirens approaching from multiple directions. 3 patrol cars, a fire truck, and an ambulance all converged on my small rural road like I was holding hostages instead of digging a trench on my own property. The first officers to arrive were clearly confused by what they found. Instead of a dangerous criminal, they saw a middle-aged man standing next to an excavator and a very obvious illegal water connection lying exposed in a muddy trench. Instead of destroyed public property, they saw clear evidence of theft and utility fraud. But Sheriff President was having none of it. She was screaming at the responding officers, demanding that they arrest me immediately, claiming that I had threatened her and destroyed county infrastructure. The problem was that her story kept changing, and her behavior was becoming increasingly unhinged. "He dug up the county water main," she shouted at Officer Martinez, a young patrolman who looked like he wished he was anywhere else. "Ma'am, this appears to be a private water line," Martinez said carefully, looking at the exposed pipes. And it looks like there are multiple unauthorized connections here. Those connections have been there for decades, she screamed. He is lying, he is trying to frame me. More neighbors started gathering as the commotion grew. Mrs. Henderson from across the street came over to see what was happening. The Patterson family from down the road stopped their morning walk to watch the spectacle. Word was spreading quickly through our small community that something major was happening at the old Jameson place. The fire chief, a calm man named Bill Kowalski, who had been dealing with emergencies for 20 years, took one look at the exposed water lines and started asking pointed questions. "How long has this secondary connection been in place?" he asked Sheriff President. "I do not have to answer your questions," she snapped. "I am ordering you to arrest this man for destruction of property." "Sheriff, you called us here," Chief Kowalski said patiently. "But I am not seeing any destroyed property. What I am seeing is what appears to be an unauthorized utility connection." That was when Sheriff President made her biggest mistake. In front of 6 other officers, a fire chief, and a growing crowd of neighbors, she completely lost control. "I do not care what you see," she screamed, her face now completely red. "I am the sheriff of this county and I am giving you a direct order. Arrest him right now or I will have all of your jobs." The silence that followed was deafening. Every officer present was staring at her with expressions that ranged from shock to disgust. This was not how a professional law enforcement officer behaved. This was how a corrupt official behaved when their crimes were exposed. Officer Martinez was the first to speak. "Sheriff, maybe we should call the county inspector to take a look at these utility connections before we make any arrests." "There will be no inspector," she shrieked. "I am handling this myself." But it was too late. The spectacle was too public, the evidence too obvious, and her behavior too erratic for anyone to ignore. Jake had been smart enough to keep his camera running, and several neighbors were recording everything on their phones. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back. The county inspector arrived within 2 hours, followed by a state police investigator and a representative from the water company. What had started as Sheriff President's attempt to intimidate me into silence had turned into a full-scale investigation of utility fraud and abuse of power. Inspector Helen Walsh was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been investigating utility fraud for over 20 years. She took one look at the exposed water lines and immediately understood what she was seeing. "This is a textbook case of utility theft," she announced to the crowd of officers and neighbors. "These secondary connections were installed without permits and without the property owner's knowledge or consent." Sheriff President tried one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Those connections were installed by the previous property owner," she claimed. "I had nothing to do with it." "Ma'am, these connections lead directly to your property," Inspector Walsh replied, following the lines with her measuring tape. "And based on the type of fittings used, they were installed within the last 5 years." The state police investigator, Detective James Morrison, started asking questions that made it clear this was now a criminal investigation. He wanted to know how long Sheriff President had lived at her address, when she had installed her pool and sprinkler system, and whether she had ever received unusually low water bills. "I am not answering any questions without my lawyer present," she said, finally showing some intelligence. "That is your right," Detective Morrison replied. "But I should inform you that we will be examining your water bills for the past 5 years and comparing them to the usage patterns we can document through this illegal connection." The math was going to be devastating for her, My water bills averaged $800 per month, while I was using maybe $200 worth of water. That meant she had been stealing $600 per month for who knows how long. Over 5 years, that would add up to more than $30,000 in theft. But the financial crime was only part of the story. The real story was about abuse of power. Here was a law enforcement officer who had been systematically stealing from a citizen, then using her authority to intimidate and threaten that citizen when he tried to seek justice. Detective Morrison interviewed me for over an hour, documenting every threat she had made, every intimidation tactic she had used, and every failure of the system to protect me from her abuse. He was particularly interested in her attempt to file false reports about utility violations and her threats to arrest me on fabricated charges. "This is exactly the kind of corruption we take very seriously," he told me. "A badge is not a license to break the law." The media attention started that afternoon. Someone had posted video of Sheriff President's meltdown on social media, and it had gone viral within hours. The local news station sent a reporter, followed by newspapers from 3 neighboring counties. The story had everything people love to hate: a corrupt police officer, theft from an innocent citizen, abuse of power, and a dramatic public exposure of the truth. The video of her screaming at other officers and demanding they arrest me for exposing her crimes was playing on every local news station by evening. Sheriff President tried to control the damage by claiming she was being persecuted for doing her job, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The illegal water connections, the documentation of theft, the recorded threats, and her public meltdown had destroyed any credibility she might have had. The county commissioners called an emergency meeting that evening. I was not invited, but I heard from neighbors who attended that it was brutal. Sheriff President tried to defend her actions, but the commissioners had already seen the videos and heard from the investigators. "This is not about a water dispute," Commissioner Davis said, according to Mrs. Henderson, who was there. "This is about a law enforcement officer who abused her authority to cover up her own crimes." The writing was on the wall. Her career was over, her reputation was destroyed, and criminal charges were inevitable. The woman who had thought her badge made her untouchable was about to learn that no one is above the law. At least, that is what I hoped would happen. Sheriff Karen President's resignation letter was submitted at 6:00 a.m. the next morning, probably written by her lawyer in a desperate attempt to minimize the legal consequences she was facing. The letter was brief and contained no admission of wrongdoing, but it did not matter. Everyone knew why she was resigning. The county commissioners accepted her resignation immediately and announced that a full investigation would be conducted into her conduct during her time in office. They also announced that the state police would be taking over law enforcement duties in our county until a new sheriff could be appointed. But resignation was not going to be enough to save her from the consequences of her actions. Detective Morrison had built a solid case for multiple felony charges, including theft of services, abuse of power, official misconduct, and intimidation of a witness. The dollar amount of water she had stolen pushed the charges into felony territory, and her use of her official position to cover up the crimes made everything worse. The state police executed a search warrant on her house 3 days after her resignation. They found detailed records of her water usage going back 7 years, including receipts for pool maintenance and lawn care that would have been impossible without the stolen water. They also found emails between her and county officials discussing ways to delay or dismiss my complaints. The corruption was even deeper than I had realized. She had not just been stealing my water. She had been using her position to pressure county employees into ignoring my legitimate complaints. The nervous clerk who had kept making excuses about my paperwork had been acting on Sheriff President's direct orders. The financial restitution alone was staggering. The state inspector calculated that she had stolen over $43,000 worth of water over a 7-year period. Add in interest, penalties, and punitive damages, and she was looking at paying back nearly $70,000. But for me, the money was never the most important part. The most important part was that justice was finally being served. The woman who had used her badge to intimidate and threaten me was facing serious criminal charges that could result in years in prison. Her trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but she never made it to trial. Her lawyer negotiated a plea agreement that required her to plead guilty to felony theft and abuse of power charges. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 5 years of probation, and full restitution of all stolen water costs plus damages. The day she was sentenced, I sat in the courtroom and watched her stand before the judge in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. The woman who had once threatened to destroy my life with false charges was now just another convicted felon facing the consequences of her actions. "Your abuse of the public trust is particularly serious," Judge Harrison said during sentencing. "Citizens must be able to trust that law enforcement officers will protect them, not prey upon them." The community healing took longer than the legal resolution. Many residents had known or suspected that Sheriff President was corrupt, but no one had been willing to stand up to her. My case had opened the floodgates, and other victims started coming forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse. The new sheriff, appointed by the state, implemented new policies for accountability and transparency. Citizens could now file complaints directly with the state police instead of relying on local officials who might be compromised. Body cameras became mandatory for all interactions with the public. Regular audits were scheduled to prevent future corruption. 6 months after the whole ordeal began, I was finally able to enjoy my property the way I had originally planned. My water bills were back to normal. The illegal connections had been properly removed and the lines rerouted. I built the workshop I had been planning and started enjoying the peaceful rural life I had been seeking. But more importantly, I had learned something valuable about standing up for what is right. The system is not perfect, and sometimes corrupt people find their way into positions of power. But when good people are willing to fight back, justice can prevail. I still think about Sheriff Karen President sometimes, especially when I am working in my garden or relaxing on my porch. Not with anger or hatred, but with a sense of satisfaction that comes from knowing I did the right thing. She thought her badge made her untouchable, but she learned the hard way that no one is above the law. Sometimes the little guy wins. Sometimes justice prevails. And sometimes when you refuse to be intimidated, the truth really does set you free.